The topic of the talks is something very specific. I don't talk about a lot of things. And I say this often because it's very important actually for us to realize what the topic of the talks are. And that realization that that's what the topic of the talk is allows the mind to start seeing why all of the things that are said are said. So what's put forward is a conceptual framework, a description, an explanation of life from a certain perspective. It's not the truth. Everything that is said is a concept. Everything that anyone has ever said or written down is a concept. So no one has ever uttered a word of truth about life. It's always a concept, a description, a pointer. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So that in itself is a pointer, a concept. If we hear that something is being separated out as being the only truth in the manifestation, the impersonal sense of I am. Not the thought I am, not the thought I am this or that, I'm good or bad, but something that is what being referred to here as the truth in the manifestation. Manifestation can also mean in our experience the impersonal sense of I am, the sense I exist. And if we stop thinking about what I am and just drop into the sense, the feeling, the being. This in meditation, if someone has a meditation practice, especially if it's a meditation practice which is not really a practice, it's just something you do when you feel like it with no objective, allowing everything to be as it is, that really would be what I would say true meditation is. It's not something you are doing to achieve something. It's about resting, allowing everything to be as it is. That means if thinking is happening, allow the thinking to be as it is. The idea that meditation looks like something in particular can in fact be an obstacle to meditation happening. So you're off duty. You're actually off duty in life. Life is happening. And we just don't seem to realize this, to recognize that life is happening not because I'm doing it, but because life is a happening. And included in that happening, there is a belief that is not seeing that, a belief that says, no, I am doing it. And even that is a happening, it's part of the happening. And there is an aspect of the experience, a very fundamental aspect of the experience that can witness what is happening as a happening. Witness everything that is happening as not my doing. And so if there is a dropping into this place of being, there is the sense I exist. It doesn't really tell us what exists. It doesn't say I as such and such exists. That's why it's referred to as the impersonal sense of I am. And then around that impersonal sense of I am, because of the nature of this experience of life, the images, the experience of wraps around and creates secondary senses of who I am. The sense I am Roger living in this world, that's not actually a problem. That's not an obstacle that needs to be overcome. What is the problem is when there is the sense and the belief and the thought, I am Roger, the doer of everything that is happening through me, and then that becomes a self-image. So once that self-image is recognized as being based on a belief that is not really accurate when life is witnessed, when that happens, that belief tends to fall away. It starts being undermined. The working mind, the part of the intellect that is being informed and starting to see life for itself, according to what it's being informed with, according to the pointers. The working mind starts to see that so many aspects of the human being are mechanical, are automatic. And as it sees this, time and time again, sees the reactions happening, the movements in life that are dictated to by what the circumstance presents. What the circumstance presents is not in our control. We find ourselves in circumstance, and then the body and the mind respond to that circumstance. So if someone asks a question, an answer comes, but if the question wasn't asked, no question of an answer. And if the sense of hunger arises, then there is a movement towards food. If that sense of hunger doesn't arise, no movement towards food. Unless, your friend says, let's go for food. And you think, oh, well, I'll enjoy spending time with them. But once again, that request or that statement, let's go for food, part of the circumstance. So we find ourselves moving as a consequence, as a reaction to something that came before. So what really are the talks about? The talks are about happiness in daily living for the human being, happiness in daily living for the individual. And the human being has been seeking happiness for a long, long time. Humanity has been seeking happiness. When we look at where humanity is seeking happiness, we see that so far the ingrained design of the human being is to believe that happiness is to be found in circumstance and outcomes. And it's fair to say that humanity has been seeking happiness in outcomes, and humanity isn't happy. We're quite productive, but now it seems like it's time for the evolution to change from productivity. A lot of progress has happened where now humans find themselves essentially born and can survive because the structures are in place. Whereas a long time ago, humans were born and all of the energy needed to go into mastering survival. Now that that's happened, a movement towards happiness while living is happening. And that requires a shift from outcomes, which is what survival required, to a place where happiness for the human being is available. It isn't available in outcomes. So essentially there needs to be an upgrade to our system. A change in our belief system. So what I'm pointing at is that humanity is now seeking happiness in outcomes, and happiness in outcomes isn't available. So what is this happiness? It turns out that happiness for the human being is happiness through peace of mind. Peace of mind regardless of the situation or circumstance that we find ourselves in. This because this is quite clear that life is always a mix of pleasure and pain. No matter how intently we try to control life, it's not something that we can control. It's not something we're producing. It's like an avalanche. It's got its own momentum. It's coming down the mountain. And the idea that my happiness is to be found in the avalanche unfolding as I would like it, as I think it should unfold, means that we're not going to be happy. So the idea that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 the belief my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, which really means life looking how I would like it to look. That's what it really means. And when we look at it this way, like life is going to turn out as it's going to turn out. It's moving. It is a movement. And then we have an idea that says, now this is how I want it to turn out. And that's going to be where my happiness is to be found. It's a recipe for disappointment. And so if happiness actually was to be found in life turning out as we'd like, we might as well conclude that happiness isn't available. Because it's very clear that the nature of life is that it'll turn out how it's going to turn out, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So the idea that, or the notion that I'm putting forward is our happiness is not to be found in outcomes, which is great news. Because if it was, based on the nature of life, we have problems. It turns out our happiness is available based on our attitude to life, based on our relationship to what happens in life, based on our relationship to how the avalanche comes down the mountain. So if our relationship to the avalanche is that it needs to be a certain way, that relationship, that attitude, is going to create frustration and resistance. It's going to create a sense of uncomfortableness with life. A sense of uncomfortableness because the belief says that my completion is dependent on life turning out a certain way, and when life doesn't, that's going to effectively be an attack on my idea of who I am. And if our attitude to life, our attitude to the avalanche is such that actually it can keep unfolding exactly as it's going to unfold, and what I am isn't dependent on how it unfolds. That's a radically different attitude to life. Now, is this just a belief system that what I am is not affected by what happens in outcomes? Or is it something more than that? And from my own experience and understanding, the seeing, as we all have the capacity to see what's being pointed at here, when it becomes clear that the resistance is simply a resistance because of certain beliefs, and that when those beliefs fall away, the resistance falls away with it. And what's very evident is that the resistance falls away, and what's left is a natural state of being. So this peace, this attitude of being equanimitous with life unfolding however it unfolds, is not a new belief system. It's actually the very nature of the core of the human being. The nature of the core of the human being, I would say, is to witness if I'm complete. Self-image. The beliefs stem from having a unbalanced view of what the human being is, of the human being. Very familiar with the physical aspects. That's clear in our experience. That's front and center. Familiar with the emotional and the thought aspects of the human being. But the consciousness aspect of the human being, that which is primal to the experience of life, the consciousness that functions through the body and is aware of life, is aware of the thinking, is aware of the feelings, has this innate sense of I am existence in it. A sense of I am that doesn't change from the time we were very young all the way up to death and anywhere in between. If there is the capacity to drop into the core of the human, we find, I am. I haven't aged. At that core, we say, I don't even know my gender if we're resting in the core of the human being. It doesn't have personality, it doesn't have age or gender, it doesn't have preferences. It's when we go to the core. And then all the other things, the preferences, and they're the aspects of the human being that we're familiar with. And the complete human being is the package of all of those things. And so we've always, the complete human being is always what's been here. It's just that recognition of a very core aspect of the human has been overlooked. And why is this aspect of the human being, this consciousness, so crucial? It's because it's the part of the human being that isn't affected by circumstance. If you were in an unfortunate situation and the doctors said, look, in order to save your life, we have to remove an arm or both arms. If we were relating to ourselves purely on the physical level, that's an attack on who I am, like some of me is being lost. To the extent that we were familiar with the consciousness, that operation could happen. And if we closed our eyes, you don't even require closing your eyes, you just go to that core and you go, I didn't get touched. The core didn't extend into my arms and now there's some of the core that has been removed. And so when the body starts getting older and failing, the core is still there. When people don't do what they said they're going to do and we get let down, the core is still there. When great things happen, we have fun with friends and maybe get gifts, life circumstance gives us bonuses. They're great, they're part of the flow of life, but they don't add to the core of who we are. To the extent we don't know ourselves at that core level, and we only know ourselves on a level of externals, then life means adding or subtracting from who I am, from my idea of who I am. So what prevents us from knowing ourselves at our core? It's this self-image. So the idea that we have about life and ourself, an idea that has been put in place based on the way the life experience is designed. The life experience is designed for us to feel that I am the one making things happen, that I am a separate, independent entity in control of everything I think, feel, say, and do. So from a young age, around the age of, it starts from infancy, where the consciousness becomes more and more linked to a particular name and form. So when you see a newborn baby, It's very clear that the consciousness hasn't identified with the body, with the form. You can see the body can grab itself, or the baby, you could see the baby seeing through the eyes and seeing its hand, but having no self-reference to that. So it's as though the consciousness in a baby is witnessing everything without any sense of any of it being specifically it, maybe the sense that it is everything. And then in time, as the body starts to develop, the brain starts to develop due to inputs, stimuli from the environment, the brain starts creating, let's say, neural networks, and the experience starts to change. We start to see that the baby starts to recognize that the hand actually has something to do with itself, as opposed to the hand being different from an object that it sees. Or so the hand is seen to be a part of what I am. And then at around age 2.5 or 3, that identification plus the development of the intellect, you could say, becomes complete to the point where the ego comes in. And the child now starts claiming ownership over things, me and mine. And so all of this is a development that happens based on the new conditioning that life delivers. And the baby's not in control of this. The baby's a product, and the child is a product of this. And so it's this sense of me and mine that has been put in place by the fact that the intellect has developed to a point where this concept starts to make sense based on the experience of life. And so that's the belief in personal doership, the belief in being a separate, independent entity. It's kicked in based on the experience of life. And once that belief is in place, a subsequent belief that says, I require certain things in order to be complete. I require pleasure in order to be complete. That kicks in. And so you have this identity which is seeing life as not a happening, but as my doing and the other's doing. And what I need in order to be complete is for the other to do what I want, for life to deliver what I need, what I want. And so that identity covers up access to the core of the human being. It means that throughout life we're going to feel guilt and blame and pride based on this deeply ingrained belief that I'm the doer and the other is the doer, and have worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So all of these things that I've just mentioned are the ways that uncomfortableness manifests in life. And it's all attitudinal, not circumstantial. So this guilt, blame and pride, worry and expectation is part of this belief system that has been put in place by life, become part of our system. And it means that when we're living life, there are these arisings of guilt, blame and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And it's that which creates an uncomfortableness in the human being. That is the uncomfortableness in the human being. It's the uncomfortableness that drives us to seek, because intuitively There is an understanding that this isn't my true nature. Something's wrong here. There has to be more to life than this. So the movement away from suffering, away from a life of uncomfortableness, to happiness for the human being or peace of mind is a natural progression, driven by the deep understanding, the deep intuitive knowing that what I am is not at my core uncomfortable, feeling lost, feeling like something is missing, feeling in need, feeling dependent. All of that comes in place when life ingrains beliefs based on how the experience is received. And so at some point, life starts to offer an opportunity for those beliefs to be challenged, for those beliefs to be looked at. It starts delivering new conditioning as part of the experience that suggests actually what we are at our core is not something that has to or that does feel uncomfortable in life. So human beings that have woken up to this, because life historically has brought about the change. Life historically has brought about a contemplation, moving past certain attitudes to life that have been seen to be not congruent with how life actually unfolds. And when in history people have gone past the false idea of who we are, gone past the uncomfortable feelings that come from that false idea, and start to feel that there's a way of living life that is optimal, a way of living life that means that we can remain connected to ourselves, appreciate life even when life is unfortunate on a circumstantial level. When that happens to some people, there is a natural desire to share that, a natural desire to help others move from what seems to be standard to something that's available. Also, that sharing, that pointing is part of the movement, part of the evolution. And so life through that, the insight of others, starts to deliver new conditioning to us, saying, hey, this is available. Happiness for the human being is your birthright. Suffering is an error. Suffering is a result of a misunderstanding. Have a look at life. Have a look according to the concepts, the pointers that are being presented by whoever is putting forward. So in this case, I'm putting forward a set of pointers towards the dynamic that creates suffering for humans, and pointers that starts to allow maybe a looking at the nature of life and see, wow, that those beliefs aren't supported when I see life beyond the surface experience. So one of the supporting concepts for us to see that we're not the doers is the suggestion that a human being in each moment is one way. The way that they have been designed by life up to this point in time. We've grown like a plant growing. A plant doesn't dictate how it grows. It follows its biological movement. It doesn't decide, but rather responds and grows. And the human being is the same. The egg and the sperm come together, create a single unit that then grows. And whether it grows perfectly or imperfectly, according to certain biological standards, is just destiny. It's a result of a whole lot of factors that the human being has never been in control of. Some people are given higher IQs than others. Some people are given faster twitch muscles than others. Everyone has their unique makeup, their gifts and their shortcomings. And that's a product of our growth based on two factors, we could say: the genetic structure and the up-to-date conditioning that life has delivered up to that point in time. And so in each moment, the human being is one way. Not one or possibly another, just one way. And the circumstance that happens is singular, one particular circumstance. And the combination of the two, the circumstance plus the makeup, creates a specific movement that's a continuation of life. So the way the human speaks or thinks, acts, is what is being pointed out here, not our doing, but rather impersonal. If we can find a factor, another factor that is part of our biological and psychological movement in each moment, then this concept falls flat. But if we look, we find that there isn't another factor, because what I've said is quite broad. The human being, on a biological and psychological level, has grown and has been affected by the circumstance in each moment, which is the new conditioning. And the combination of their current structure and the new conditioning becomes their new position. And so the human is always changing, continually affected by life. So what I'm saying is simply new conditioning. How it affects, how it changes us, not in my control, not in your control, but life is always changing us. And so in any moment, we're one way. And then the response to life is going to be according to what life presents in that moment, what is seen, what's heard, smelled, touched, or tasted, and what response that creates in the human being. If this is seen clearly, the notion that I am the doer, I am in control and the other is in control, the other should have acted differently, I should have acted differently, there's no space for that. It's seen as a complete fantasy. A fantasy that life has put in place based on how it designed us. So if the fantasy exists, the fantasy that I am the doer, it's not our doing. Life has put it there. And that's what creates the uncomfortableness. That's what creates the blame towards the other, the hatred towards the other, what allows us to see the other as an enemy or a competitor, a rival. And it's that same principle that allows us to hate ourselves, to feel uncomfortable with who we are and what we've done in life so far. The idea, I am the doer and the other is the doer. It's the basis on which guilt and blame sit. And pride is based on the same belief about me being the doer, but is a reaction to those outcomes that deliver positive outcomes, positive results. Look what I achieved. Look what I achieved. Look how good I am. Guilt, blame, pride, based on the idea I'm the doer. And it's really simple. I mean, I could have said this in the first 2 minutes. I mean, we have been, but when you really look at it, the idea is the human being is one way in each moment, and they weren't in control of the way they are. And if we really see this, in an instant, in theory, in an instant, we might realize, wow, I have an idea of myself and the other that is completely out of line with a seeing of life more specifically, a more specific seeing of life. Now, in most likelihood, we understand this intellectually when we hear it, but it doesn't have this radical cutting effect in the first instant. But if that understanding is there on an intellectual level, it makes sense that as we continue to live life, observation of how we function and an observation of how the others function can start to happen. And as that observation sees time and time again, not my doing, not the other's doing, the other is functioning exactly as they are designed to function in this moment. They really couldn't have done it differently. I couldn't have done it differently. And so not just an intellectual, but when we feel a reaction happen, when we hear an answer coming out of us, and it becomes very evident that yes, that's based on my family's conditioning, my culture, my biological preferences, my genetic makeup as to what I like and what I don't like. And so each time this is seen, the concept goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And at some point, it's impossible to see ourselves the old way. You can actually find it, I wonder how, I just can't see myself as the doer. I can't see the other as the doer. Not because I now have a new belief, but because the old belief that simply doesn't hold water has fallen away. And so the seeing of life happening is natural. It's not something that we see and then we have to say, I'm not the doer, they're not the doer. That concept can come up in the interim when the old beliefs are being dissolved, because the old belief will come up and blame, let's say, will happen. And then a recognition, this blame is based on this doership, and I've been seeing it for a long time. I'm not the doer, they're not the doer. So for a while it comes up and it cuts off, it weakens the functioning of the old belief. But at some point, the old belief is dissolved, it doesn't function, the blame doesn't happen. Because is not in line with what happens, that we have what we've found is pleasure, going comfortableness, want come true. For a while we might say, but as we start looking, I know what pleasure is. This would be just a different form of pleasure. And so once our own experience and a cognition, a recognition that actually all these different forms of pleasure, they're just different, but they're all pleasure. Once that happens, I haven't received ongoing happiness from pleasure. We start putting a tick next to the concept, many ticks next to the concept that says my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, isn't to be found in pleasure. So by putting a tick next to that, we haven't really concluded that my happiness can be found anywhere else. But we have started to weaken the movement towards pleasure, the attachment to pleasure. The belief my happiness to be found in outcome is what is referred to as attachment to outcomes, attachment to pleasure. It makes up part of the false idea of who I am. The way we can start to see that there really is a happiness outside of circumstance, a happiness available even when circumstance is painful, is when in our own experience we start being able to drop into being, which becomes much more available when all of the obsessive thinking based on these false beliefs slows down, and we understand that there is a core of the human being. It's always here. And it's the movement outward into thought that keeps us disconnected from being. But once that shift inward happens, and we rest here, and that movement into being becomes a movement that we are more familiar with. When circumstance unfolds in a way that is painful, and the thinking mind, the beliefs that I was talking about, do turn into blame, for example, or guilt, that's the uncomfortableness arising. That's the uncomfortableness based on our attitude to the circumstance. So when that happens, a thought can arise that reminds us, no, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. It's to be found at the core of who I am. And in that moment, the thinking of the thinking mind, the blame, the guilt can get cut off, and we drop into being. And we find that even in the face of having missed an aeroplane or our friend having let us down, even in the face of that circumstance which hasn't magically changed, we find ourselves content once we drop into being, outside of the story that says this circumstance is an attack on who you are. And the more often we get to drop into this space of being and realize, here I am. And we find I'm here, I'm full, I'm content, even in the face of my friend having let me down. Even in the face of me having done something that in hindsight was stupid and the outcome not good. As soon as the story about my worthlessness, which is based on the belief in doership, as soon as that stops, I drop into being and I find, here I am, happy. Not happy as some excitement feeling or bliss feeling, but a peace, happiness through peace of mind, at a remembrance of the part of me that doesn't change. And so then we get to put a tick next to the concept, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Not just one tick, but a tick each time we drop into this being. And at some point, it becomes abundantly clear that the uncomfortableness is all thought-based. It's all based on a self-image. And that what I truly am prior to that thinking is in itself content and happy. So this obsessive thinking, what we can call the thinking mind, which is based on the belief I'm the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcome. That is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it changes not by you or me doing anything. We've never been the doers in life. No one has ever been a doer. Everyone has always, at any point in time, been an instrument, designed a particular way, and automatically functioning according to their design. What's been in place in that design is the belief of doership. So no one has ever been a doer. So we don't fix this problem by being a doer. The problem gets fixed when life delivers new conditioning, such that the old conditioning gets dissolved. And I'm talking about the old conditioning in the thinking mind, because we create a conceptual distinction between the brain that knows how to speak, knows how to do math, the part of the brain that needs to function and say, okay, what do I need to buy when I go to the shops today? How much money do I need to take on holiday? How do I solve this problem? That's the working mind. The working mind isn't suffering, isn't an uncomfortableness with ourself. It doesn't disturb our peace of mind. So, and also, the thinking mind, which is where the false beliefs are and where the guilt, blame, pride, etc. comes from, that too is based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so we have this shift from suffering to peace when life delivers new conditioning that changes the conditioning in the thinking mind, changes the deeply ingrained beliefs, I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So that's what's happening when you read a book. That's what's happening sitting here in satsang. You don't need to do anything more. you will then, as destined, based on the body, at some point get up and leave and do whatever your circumstance requires of you. And the thinking of the working mind, if the concepts have become part of your up-to-date conditioning, will automatically function. So you don't need to say, okay, so in the next hour I'm going to sit down and think about this. The thinking will happen. Or not. But the point is, it will happen based on your makeup. Or not happen based on your makeup. And this notion that I don't have to do anything just doesn't make sense to us, because we're convinced I'm the doer. It's not going to happen if I don't do anything. But life is doing the changes. So you found yourself in this circumstance receiving new conditioning, that's all this is. New conditioning. And how did you come into this circumstance? It was a result of everything that came before. Seeing a poster or something on Facebook, or a friend said, hey, come and listen to this talk, you might find it interesting. If a belief in doership comes into the room, it will find this quite offensive, actually. It will find these concepts very unpalatable, and an uncomfortableness could happen. That, to me, makes complete sense, understandable. It's just an impersonal reaction of a certain belief system exposed to a concept that it thinks is nonsense. It says, I'm very much the doer, thank you very much. I don't at all like this idea. In fact, I think it's nonsense. That's why at the beginning I said the talks are about something very specific. So it's funny sometimes, like if someone gets up to leave, I completely understand. In fact, I'd encourage anyone who's not, or in life, do what you feel like. That's my suggestion. That's not telling anyone how to live life. It's saying in life, you will always do what you think or feel to do. So when someone stands up and leaves, it makes complete sense to me. The talk is not resonating with their makeup, their genes and up-to-date conditioning. But sometimes I sort of have a little chuckle to myself, because I always start off saying that these talks are about one thing only, one topic only. The topic is happiness in daily living, happiness for the human being. And whether we realize it or not, what we're truly seeking in life, the only thing that will satisfy us, is the peace of mind that we have regardless of circumstance. The peace of mind that's available. So really, what I'm talking about is that which the human being is really interested in, whether they realize it or not. And so then when someone gets up and leaves, I don't have an issue with it. That completely makes sense to me. But I think, wow, okay, they want to leave. When the topic is that which is what we're really looking for. Why? And the answer is because the concepts are not palatable to their current makeup, or the way it's delivered. Maybe I'm not palatable, whatever, it makes complete sense. But in particular, one thing is that the belief in personal doership feels confronted, assaulted by this concept, unless the person has gone to a point where something deeper hears this. Something deeper says, okay, maybe there's something here. And so the talk is put forward, it's what Ramesh used to speak about. And he was a banker. He ended up being the general manager of the Bank of India. And so he said, having been a banker for 40 years, I had to be practical. You can't be a banker and not be practical. And so when he started seeking, he said, let me approach this topic in a practical way. He'd been exposed to teachings for his whole life. He was part of a Hindu Brahmin family. And so this seeking was, very, very familiar to him. So when he retired at the age of 65, he said, okay, I'm going to inquire into this for myself. I'm not going to listen to what I've been told. And I'm going to approach this practically. This was aided by a question or a situation that happened when he was at a family satsang gathering with the family guru that they would go to on a Sunday or what have you. And Ramesh asked a question. So this is well before he retired, and it wasn't with his guru Nisargadatta Maharaj, but a family guru. And so he asked a question that he thought was a very pertinent question to ask. The question was, Sir, or Bhag, I don't know how he referred to, what will I have after enlightenment that I don't have before? Now, in the tradition he was in, clearly asking practical questions was not appreciated. So Ramesh would say that he could see, as soon as he asked the question, that the guru was about to get very angry, or was angry, and he was about to demonstrate his anger. But before he got to get angry, he noticed that quite a few people in the audience were interested in the answer to the question. So instead of getting angry, Ramesh said he gave an answer that you give when you don't really give an answer. And the answer was, when you're enlightened, you'll know. And so Ramesh said, so how helpful is that? So he said, let me approach this for myself. And so he started, I am looking for, if I drop any concepts of what I'm looking for, in practical terms, I'm looking for happiness. And I'm not sure what this happiness is. I don't have it, would be the standpoint of the seeker. If I had it, I wouldn't be seeking. So let me look at what my unhappiness is. And that means that we don't need to go off into some concept that is sort of indirect or unknown to us, something that someone has told us. We can go to our own experience. So you just wait for a situation where you can put your hand on your heart and say, in this moment I'm unhappy. And then investigate. So this is the investigation happening on a practical level for yourself based on your own experience. Rather than seeking by listening to concepts that are esoteric that another person tells you about, that you can't actually verify for yourself based on your own experience. So when he went to his unhappiness, he found time and time again that the unhappiness was essentially an uncomfortableness with himself, an uncomfortableness that disturbed the moment, disturbed the experience of life. It was always about the other or himself and circumstance. The uncomfortableness was either guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. And when we look at the story behind the guilt, the blame, the pride, we see that it's based on this belief in personal doership. And then with this investigation for ourselves, plus the pointers that come in the wisdom teachings that have been around for a long time, we can start to see what they mean when they say your happiness isn't to be found by gaining something. Enlightenment is not going to give you anything. Enlightenment is a process of loss. It's about unburdening yourself. You're unburdening yourself of the load of guilt and shame, hatred and blame. It's the dissolving of beliefs. It's the dissolving of a self-image that gets in the way. That the happiness, the peace is not a pleasure that you receive. not something you gain. It's actually the absence of the suffering. So the concepts are in simple, plain, everyday English, talking about daily living, so that once it's been understood as a framework that starts to tell us what we're really looking for is this, it's this that gets in the way, and this that gets in the way is based on these beliefs. It's a matter of going out into life, living life, and seeing for yourself the dynamics. And as that seeing happens, the understanding goes deeper and deeper. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, it uproots the deeply ingrained beliefs. And as those deeply ingrained beliefs get uprooted, we find ourselves functioning in life more or less as we did before, but without the uncomfortableness arising. And in the interim, before the understanding is total, when the understanding is, deepening, we find that the suffering still arises, but it maybe has less intensity, or it gets cut off quicker and quicker. And it gets cut off quicker and quicker because the understanding, the part of ourself that is being revealed, starts seeing the stories as errors. And they start to be given much less energy. So there's a microphone there. I've spoken for more than enough time. I was actually going to start off by asking for questions today, but because I saw some new faces, I thought it's worth going through the basics, which is not really just basics, it's what I speak about most of the time, and then the questions mean we get to elaborate on that.
I have two questions on a meta level, and you can tell me if it's not appropriate to talk about it now. One question would be, what is the outcome for society if people have this attitude?
Mm-hmm.
I could imagine concepts like marriage and getting kids is a must become weaker, because what I perceive is that marriage and getting kids in some cases is connected to the feeling of incompleteness. And once people feel complete with what they are, what they have, what they see, what they experience, concepts like marriage and getting kids could change, and this probably would change society.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be one question. Shall I?
Oh yeah, I'll address that. There's no problem. I just before, because when I said I laugh when people leave, I also know that maybe you have to leave early. So if you do, feel free. I understand that there's a lot of reasons why people can leave, so don't feel that you can't. So one of the things that happens when this deeply ingrained set of beliefs is in place is that we start following shoulds and shouldn'ts. The shoulds and shouldn'ts are there because they essentially are a strategy of getting more and more pleasure. So especially love of the other and outcomes. So the shoulds and shouldn'ts are put in place by society and by ourselves as to how life should be lived. And if we don't question, or if we don't come to see this deeper part of ourselves, we will continue to live according to that strategy of shoulds and shouldn'ts, thinking that that obviously is the best way to live. Because the shoulds and shouldn'ts say things like, if I have committed to something, I should see it through, because if I don't, then my friend won't appreciate me, won't love me. And in some cases in all cases, if we hold on to those shoulds, we tend to cut ourselves off from a place inside that is a different guidance. Now, that guidance inside doesn't tend to make us irresponsible and chaotic members of society, which is what the mind would imagine. It says, if I stop following my shoulds and shouldn'ts and I do what I feel like, then I'm really going to probably be a wild card. I might actually pick up a machine gun and start shooting people. And the answer is no. When we stop following our shoulds and shouldn'ts, we'll still function according to our biological makeup. And our biological makeup is not one that is probably designed to be irresponsible and chaotic. It's just the mind, the thinking mind, assumes that if I relax and allow life to unfold, that it's going to spiral into a chaotic situation. My experience is that the very opposite happens. Now, that life becomes much more efficient. It turns out that this thinking mind, this shoulds and shouldn'ts, a mental construct of how we should live life and what life is and who we are, tends to get in the way of a much more organic way of being and functioning. And yes, the identity in itself is an uncomfortableness. It's a sense that something is missing. So the more of these shoulds and shouldn'ts that get put in place, the more of a false idea of who we are, the stronger our false self-image of ourself becomes. And the more we identify with something we're not, the more uncomfortable we feel. And so that uncomfortableness drives us to imagine that the solution is to be found in outcomes. That's why we're driven towards outcomes, because the uncomfortableness says, and it's a feeling, and it's very convincing. It feels like truth. All you need is for the other to love you, and then everything will be okay. And so from that uncomfortableness, we do find ourselves committing to things that are based on a commitment that we wouldn't make, let's say, without that uncomfortableness driving it and telling us that is the answer, that once that happens, then everything will be okay. Now, that doesn't mean that when the uncomfortableness falls away, that we're not going to get married. There is a very clear biological preference to work together in life, to be a team. There is a biological attraction and connection that happens between people, and that's very beautiful. It's part of the pleasures in life. It doesn't come with just pleasure. Quite clearly, there's pleasure and pain in being a team with someone. But biologically, it's something that we're attracted to. And so even when the idea that something is missing, that I will be completed by the other, when that falls away, there will be a biological union, but that biological union won't be held together by glue that effectively prevents us from moving truly. So we'll be together for as long as it seems appropriate, as long as it feels appropriate. And that doesn't mean that we're going to have very short relationships either. It doesn't mean that we're destined only to have short relationships, because without the imposition on how the other should act, how we should act, without the shoulds and shouldn'ts, without the attachment keeping a relationship together, to me, it's actually very feasible that two people that are well suited come together and stay together for a whole lifetime.
Thank you. Can I ask the second question?
Yes.
It's about the teaching itself and the efficiency of teaching. What I like about your teaching is that it comes with clear concepts. It's something I can write down. I can draw mind maps, and I can color them. And actually, I think this would make sense, and this leads actually to my question. Wouldn't it make sense to apply modern ideas of how knowledge and skills are constructed in individuals to teachings like that? This would include techniques like NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. This would include visualization. Pointers could be pointers in a physical way, that we say, now we talk about this concept, and you can see the context of this concept, so I don't need to express it all the time, because we see where it is. And this would include the activation of participants, because it's very unnatural for my body, and maybe others feel it the same, to listen to someone for a long time. It's not what this body is designed for. It wants to be active. So all the modern formats of teachings focus heavily on the activation of the participants. So these three concepts, visualization, NLP, and activation of the students, do you think it would make sense to apply them to teachings like that?
Absolutely, yeah. Because this essentially is changing the neurology in the body mind. Even if we look at life as a creation in consciousness and arising in consciousness, and that ultimately there is no form, which is one perspective of what life is, and that can be seen to possibly, well, we can experience life in a way where the consciousness becomes revealed, the field of awareness in which everything happens is revealed, and it can be seen that quite feasibly what feels like solid objects are just experience, the experience in a virtual world, essentially. So even if that is the case, the fact is that when we look at what is created, it is a creation of form, a creation of time and space, a creation of causality. And in the creation, if the skull is opened up, the creation includes a brain in there. And so if we opened up the skull and then there was nothing in there, then we go, oh, this is a creation, and it's not even a creation of causality. Or it is on some level, but when we look deeper, the causality fails. But in this creation, we have to look very deep for the causality to fail. When we look on the depth of experience that's available to us, we find the causality is maintained. So the skull is opened and there is a brain. And the brain, when it's measured, correlates that the brain produces the thoughts. So from this perspective, the perspective that everything is arising in consciousness, you could say the brain doesn't create thoughts. There is no brain. There's just thoughts arising. So from this perspective, we're witnessing, we go, I don't know there's a brain here. There's just awareness and experience. So if we then look at how life presents and we investigate it, we find that causality is there's always a cause for something. We might not recognize what the cause is, but in this creation, I'm convinced that it is designed as a causal creation. So there is a cause, whether we can see it or not. And so from that perspective, we can say that the thoughts and the attitude is a direct result of the makeup in the brain. And so approaching and describing it from a causal perspective is also accurate because the creation has put in place the causality. So if a cause is adjusted, the effect is going to change. And if the cause is adjusted, it's not me adjusting the cause, but me as part of the creation adjusting the cause. So we can look at this on a causal level, and not have lost track of seeing a oneness or a totality version from the more esoteric view. So what's happening here is a change on the neural level. I'm sure that once this is observed, that in life, once more interest is put on observing the neuroscience, we'll see that there is a correlating change on the neurology. And so now there is, you're spot on, is that the understanding of how neurology changes, the neuroplasticity of the brain, etc., that understanding has developed techniques that work with that understanding the best way possible. And so someone emailed me recently and they said that they have done research into brain function, that's their specialty, and language learning. And so the way that the language is taught now is by participants actually moving around in the classroom, and apparently the learning is 6 times faster than the traditional way of learning language through repetition and memory. So you actually, you pick up a jug, and while you're saying in the language, can I have a jug of water, please? And doing the activity, or I don't know the exact sound, but role-playing and as well as speaking it, apparently has a significant effect on how this is cognized and how the brain absorbs things. So the question then is, so why don't I do that? Because I haven't been designed up to this point in time to deliver that teaching, or this teaching in that way. But there is a method to this. What the method is that a framework is delivered. The framework is delivered in a fairly consistent way, time and time again. And what tends to happen is that the feedback I get is people do listen to 2-hour satsangs, and they listen to them over and over, and they listen to 100 of them or more. Often people go to sleep listening to the satsangs, and they're playing while they're sleeping sometimes. And this is clearly life utilizing, let's say me, or in the case actually Ramesh. Ramesh is where this teaching comes from. My destiny put me in front of Ramesh, and all of this investigation was happening this way sort of before I came across Ramesh. And then Ramesh presented a framework that allowed what was already being looked at to be narrowed down and intellectually understood. And this particular framework, in my experience, gets embedded in the body, and then through daily living, that's where the real change comes. So we start to see that this is what's happening, this activity, rather than just sitting and listening, is functioning already, but it's functioning once the audience goes out into daily life. And the concepts then start getting applied and seen for yourself. And it's absolutely certain that if this wasn't the case, if we just sit and listen without an encouragement for what is described to become observed for yourself based on your own experience, if that process didn't happen, the change would be rudimentary. The neural networks wouldn't reconnect, wouldn't reform in a new way. And so in between given I'm talking about this, there's an opportunity to talk about something that a lot of people wonder about. In between, people start to experience life in a way that can be flat and lifeless. What we talk about, having left one shore but not got to the other shore, the no man's land, the spiritual desert, where they can't engage in life the way that they used to. It seems futile, it seems shallow. It's seen that actually all I'm trying to do in my old way is get approval from the other, get love from the other. And when that's seen to be a whole lot of effort for nothing, doesn't really give us what we thought. We can't engage in that way anymore. That's actually the brain's now starting to change, but it hasn't maybe changed as completely as it can. It's in a halfway new structure, and so the outcome, the output of the experience is to feel flat. But in that flatness, more observation is still happening. More space is given for observation, because in that flatness we have less motivation to go out into life and engage the way we used to. And people will find themselves sitting at home watching videos and reading books and things like that. So it's quite amazing how this process happens. And it is all about reconditioning and changing the structure of the brain, or the structure of the belief systems. To me, the belief systems and the brain patterning equate to the same thing. So we sort of imagine that beliefs are like data somewhere, but actually I think that it's probably more likely that it's a particular way that the electromagnetics go through the brain, and what links are there as to creates thought. And so that explains why somewhere in the middle people feel not necessarily great. And then that continues to create a change, and at some point the experience becomes one that is more than enough. The connections, let's say, the whatever needs to happen has happened, and the experience is different. So I think it's a great idea for someone to adapt the teachings, to develop the teachings. I don't feel that there's a shortcoming in them in and of themselves, because I think they really work in a mysterious way this way. You could find a shortcoming if you compared it to a theoretical ideal that includes modern techniques. And so if someone came up with a program and implemented, I think it will be fantastic. And in fact, I'm sure that that's how teachings are evolving. That is what's happening now. The idea of a guru in the traditional sense, to me, no longer makes sense as our intellect starts to develop. And so a guru in the old sense is, hand yourself over, and there's a lot of aspects when you look at traditional spirituality that are probably helpful at a certain point, but at another point they become a big hindrance. So the guru idea of someone who is superior and someone who has access to the divine that we don't have, for example, I think that model is outdated. To me, it makes sense that some people have been changed ahead of other people, and then that change does say that they do have something, let's say, to offer that the person doesn't have, but not in a way that, is superior, because this non-doership. So superiority is an attitude. So once the non-doership is seen, it's like, but it's available to everyone, as long as life delivers the change.
Especially with the last two sentences, I think you are already in the small circle of people who gave up the idea of expert and idiots, mm-hmm. and actually come to the modern perspective of the teacher is someone who is very curious how they will develop. Mm-hmm. Actually giving certain concepts and then letting them play and letting them explore and live what has been discussed, and then they grow. Mm-hmm. And then the teacher is more in the role of the curious person who wants to know how this guy, how does he solve this problem intellectually, mm-hmm. and how does he explain, and where are his or her flaws, and how does the other one correspond, and how do they solve this communication issue.
Yeah.
So I think this is a very nice environment, and it's probably it fits better to this human machines who actually wants to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree. And on top of that, the being attached to outcomes causes so many problems. So really, I've got the attitude, and Ramesh would say it is, the concepts are put out. They're just concepts. Do what you would like with them. They're not there to tie you up. In fact, when we look at what the concept is really pointing at, it says the human being will act one way, the way they're designed, which means I understand that everyone in each moment will act not the way I say anyone should, but the way they're designed. And so the concepts are really saying in each moment you're free to be who you are. And then that's a very freeing suggestion of how to live life, because it's a suggestion that says I can't tell you how to live life. I can only deliver information, and then that information goes to work. Or we could say you run with the information however feels fit. So there's no attachment to an outcome, knowing that I'm not in control of an outcome. The other person isn't in control of that. I'm interested, I'm curious to see how the information gets integrated. Yeah. You can, but it means that the recording won't include the question. I think you'll do a good job, yeah.
The sentence that we are not the doer still makes me feel not so fine. Mm-hmm. Because what is the difference between an animal and a human being? When a lion is killing another animal, it is his nature. Mm-hmm. And that means when I'm not the doer and I do what I'm feeling, that, for example, what has happened in Germany 60 years before, Adolf Hitler and all the German people who have killed 6 billion Jews, mm-hmm. They are not responsible at all. Mm-hmm. When I listen to your teaching.
Sure.
In a way, I can understand that when I look at my personal life, I got children and was married and everything, and I couldn't. I thought when I was young, I'm a good mother, and now I'm older. I see I have changed, and this and this and this was not good. Mm-hmm. That means I couldn't. I had to act how I was at that time. That I can understand. Mm-hmm. But on the other way, I think we have also we have the possibility to choose if I am constructive, positive, or if I am destructive. That means I'm killing people, I'm exploiting people. It allows for me to do all these evil things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I don't mean to be. I'll disagree with the logic, right? But it makes sense that you that it's settled this way. So the logic that you've put forward is that if I believe I'm not the doer, then I will act in a in a particular way. Whereas if I believe I'm the doer, then I can choose which way I'm going to act. And so the belief in doership is described here as an attitude towards what is happening, a belief, an interpretation about what is happening that comes after the event. So the human being acts based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. The belief in doership is a belief system or an attitude that sees how they acted and says, I did that. I was the doer. So the falling away of the belief in doership doesn't actually change how we function on a biological level. What it does is it changes how we function on a attitudinal level. And what turns out is that this attitudinal level, when we see ourselves as the doer, and when we see that my happiness is dependent on outcomes, creates, as part of that identity, a load of guilt and shame, hatred and blame. And it's that load of hatred and blame and guilt and shame that actually is most destructive in life. It's the load of shoulds and shouldn'ts, and not seeing ourselves as instruments through which source is functioning, that creates discrimination, judges the others as appropriate or inappropriate, and creates all these different levels. They're all psychological levels based on this this load that comes from this attitudinal belief. So when the doership falls away, what actually falls away with it is our propensity to hate, our propensity to discriminate. And so the tragedies that have happened in life have happened probably driven out of a load of guilt and shame and blame and hatred. And so this is why I say it's complete, that I didn't want to seem like I'm disagreeing with you. I'm disagreeing, but I can completely understand why it's been taken this way, the concept's taken this way, is that the thinking mind that is convinced it is the doer sees all of its choices and says, I chose that. So then it imagines, if I dissolve, then who is going to be there to choose? And who is going to be able to choose good over evil? But in fact, the mechanics of choice happening are not happening because of doership, but because of our biological makeup and the circumstance we find ourselves in. So the choice is still going to happen. Choice simply means we're presented with a circumstance and there are several theoretical options, several options on the table. I can go to the left, I can go straight, I can go to the right, to keep it simple, or there's a menu card with 10 meals on it. So that's the circumstance. There are 10 options. And then based on the biological makeup, which is not just, when I say biological, I don't just mean pure biological. It can include a lot of conditioning on the biological level. So not the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, but things like, I grew up being given chocolate cake when I came home from school, and I really like chocolate cake. And so that becomes part of my up-to-date conditioning, or part of my conditioning. So when I'm presented with the menu and I see chocolate cake on the menu, it's one of the options. And then the picking of that, the choosing, is based on it's a biological choice. And similarly, if I see a dog being abused by someone, my makeup in that moment may get me to run away, or it may force me to intervene. And so I look at that with the belief in doership, and I'd say, it's me, the doer, that chose to help the dog. And then we assume, well, if I'm not the doer, or if I believe I'm not the doer, then that movement is going to stop, whereas actually that movement happened based on a different set of dynamics. And so often the question is, if my attachment to outcomes falls away, what's going to move me in life? It's based on the same assumption that what moves us is my attachment to outcomes. And the answer is that if your attachment to outcomes fall away, the body is still going to have its biological preferences. And a biological preference is always going to move towards its preference and away from pain. But it's not going to have the same makeup as the attachment to outcomes. Says, I need my preference delivered. And I need my non-preference to not be delivered. Biologically, we'll move towards the preference, but if it doesn't get delivered, there is an understanding, an acceptance of that. The attachment doesn't have an acceptance. And so in the same way, we're biologically on a very rudimentary level. when the beliefs in doership falls away, we're actually biologically designed to want to see the others happy, want to see animals happy, or at least in as comfortable a situation as possible. And so that explains how, without the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes, I'm still going to, if asked to help a friend, consider the situation, and then based on my makeup in that moment, make a decision which could well include, yes, of course I'll help you. So
It means when my biological makeup is not like this. That means when my biological makeup is like, I'm satisfied in torturing someone else, I do that.
in torturing someone else, did you say?
Torturing. I
Like,
torturing someone.
Yeah, well, as I was saying, I think that tendency of something like torture and taking pleasure out of it comes from a deeply ingrained hatred towards the other. It's driven by that. So that, to me, is there when the psychological component of the human being is there. And it's much less likely to be a natural movement of biological. I tend to think that if, in short, if all of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome fell away, we would have an enlightened society that in practice would look far different to what society looks like now, and we would find that we are probably moving much more to natural communism, a system that is an ideal. It's being developed as a theoretical ideal. It simply can't work when human beings that are being forced into this theoretical ideal still have the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. It's an ideal that will work when people function that way naturally.
I just want to say, there's a really well-known psychiatrist. She's no longer alive, but Alice Miller. She wrote Drama of the Gifted Child. Mm-hmm. It's incredible. But she wrote another book where she actually studied all the tyrants in history, and Hitler was one of them. And she studied their childhoods and their upbringings and basically the conditioning that formed them. And it's a fascinating read, and because when you actually look at the way they were brought up and their actual conditioning, the actions that they took later on, no matter how volatile or terrible, really, they make so much sense. Mm-hmm. So I just, in terms of like this teaching or this concept that we're made up of our biology and our up-to-date conditioning, like there's such understanding why people do such terrible things. But I also understand what you're saying in terms of it's hard to accept injustice and all of these other things. But I just thought I'd mention that book or her.
Yeah. So the this attitude or this understanding of how life unfolds doesn't prevent terrible things from being terrible things. It doesn't make them acceptable on a biological level, but it makes them completely understandable. That to me is the difference, is that if we see that life is a creation of duality, interconnected opposites, if there's good, there's going to be evil. If there's health, there's going to be disease and wealth, poverty. To the extent that we accept intellectually that this is what this creation is, it's a creation of interconnected opposites. It's a story of time and space and duality. Fundamentally, we could say it's a non-duality. Fundamentally, but experientially, the story is of duality. And so that's the simple question: why? Why is there evil in the world? And the answer is this is part of the story of duality. For the evil acts, there are equivalent kind acts. And so then, why is there terrorism? In a simple sense, it's just the answer is because. That's the answer to why. Because it's when the why is has an idea that life needs to be a particular way, And if this creation isn't a creation of love on all levels, then wanting it to be a creation of love on all levels is going to bring in the question, why? As soon as that idea of how life should look falls away and we say, oh, life is a creation of duality, that's why. It doesn't make it pleasurable. It doesn't make pain pleasurable. It makes it understandable.
Sort of natural compassion might arise if, like, say, I see that if I were to trade atom by atom with Adolf Hitler, I would do exactly every single thing that he did.
Yeah.
So natural compassion, probably that's the only way compassion may arise.
It is. I agree. That's where compassion comes from. Is to, and so in this, the other day, someone asked, "What is love?" And the concept of love in this teaching is the absence of hate, love in its most basic form. And the absence of hate in the face of the cruelty in life means to see the other as an instrument through which source is functioning in order for this experience to be exactly what it is. So to see the other as not the doer. And then when the other delivers pain to me or someone I love or even a stranger, then that pain is seen to be destiny unfolding. So I say, it's my destiny as part of this story of life to experience pain in this moment. And it was destiny of the other as part of this story of life to be designed in order to deliver my destiny. And this becomes acceptable once we're connected to the core of our being and realize that the pain is an experience and not actually an attack on who I am. That if I find myself connected to my being, the being is content with being here now. That is where the contentment actually comes from, not from anything else. And so to the extent that that connection is there, meaning I'm always connected to source, recognizing that it's source functioning through me, source functioning through the other. So to the extent we can remain connected to source, our existence remains unchallenged by what the other does and what the consequences or the effect is to us.
If all 7 billion people on the planet woke up, if all 7 billion people on the planet woke up, would duality cease to exist?
No, dualism would cease to exist. Duality would continue. So dualism is an attitude. So duality really means that the experience of life, so after awakening, because you can have an awakening where the experience qualitatively changes such that the fundamental non-duality of life is recognized. And for a while, there is a living and experiencing life such that the separation and the duality tends to shift into the background, and what is seen is the non-dual. And so some people would argue, yes, liberation or enlightenment is the falling away of duality, both attitudinally and experientially. There is now non-duality. But that non-duality on an experiential basis is actually being influenced by certain concepts that are still going round in the brain and actually shutting down a faculty of the brain that is believed to be part of the problem. And so it's creating this oneness experience that can remain sort of stable. So someone says, not an experience, this is now how I know myself and life. And the process then continues to change where it starts to be acknowledged that, I am, if I just relax and stop insisting that life is not real, that life is an illusion, if that part of the thinking relaxes, and it's not only thinking, if someone would say, no, I see this oneness, not because it's actually the freedom from concept, the freedom from belief, but the funny thing is the belief gets inserted in very subtle ways. And so certain pointers from wisdom teachings, which the wisdom teachings say are not truth, they are the teaching, those concepts get turned into beliefs. They bring about a shift, and then the beliefs remain in place, which can influence the experience, that make it feel and seem like oneness. At some point, even those beliefs get challenged as being, I don't know that it's absolutely true. Even though the experience is now changed and is supporting the beliefs, let's not take experience as a reflection of truth. That's one of the things at the beginning. Don't take experience as a reflection of truth. And just because we call the new state not experience, which is just a technicality based on a definition of the word experience, the fact is even that oneness qualitative feel is still experience. All of life is always experience. And once that clicks in, we start to say, oh, this experience that has changed to demonstrate a oneness I'm taking it to be a reflection of reality and truth. And so that is deep, that's further ingraining the beliefs that life is non-duality on an experiential level. And once that starts to weaken, we see the duality comes back in as, actually, in practice, there is time and space. In practice, there is causality. All of these things, through those other teachings, have been relegated to the category of apparent. And then you go, no, actually it's part and parcel of the whole thing. It's not apparent, it is part of it. And then we go, this is different to this on an experiential level. So the duality comes back without bringing in suffering. So duality doesn't end. Duality is actually how life is to be lived, with a connection to self. That means that we can also see the fundamental non-duality. The two can exist together. And what falls away is dualism. Dualism is what happened, let's say, in the metaphor of Adam and Eve, where in the Christian story or the Judaism story, eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now that's dualism. That's where the knowledge of good and evil is what should and shouldn't be. Right doings and wrong doings. What I need and what I don't need. How I should act and how I shouldn't act. All of that is an overlay, an attitudinal overlay on the duality of life, judging it as appropriate or inappropriate. Obscuring ourselves from the part of ourself that is actually non-dual, not subject to the comings and goings of life.
On the level of dualism, can you speak about, from the framework of these concepts, can you speak about environmentalism, how we approach being stewards of the planet, not from a doership perspective or from a wounded activist perspective, but the fact that we have a climate crisis, our food is contaminated with toxic synthetic chemicals, our water's poisoned, 80% of certain foods are genetically modified, and most of us are consuming and engaging in it unconsciously. And, we're in a slow path to our own self-destruction. Short-term solutions are creating our long-term ending. So, from a non-activist doership perspective, how can we approach, stewardship with these concepts in mind?
Mm-hmm. This can be taken the wrong way, but remember, I'm saying this from a certain perspective. God created life, right? God created the problems in life. Let God deal with them, is one perspective. Right? That's the perspective which allows us to rest and find what's really important in life. When we're insistent that we have to fix life, right? That insistence, that direction outward, obscures us from what is really important to us, which is happiness right now. Happiness for the individual. And happiness for the individual is not dependent on outcomes. It's not dependent on life existing in 1,000 years' time or in 2 days' time. It's a happiness with what is right now. And to the extent that we believe otherwise, which is really what happens when these ideas of doership and attachment once we believe it'll all be okay, I can rest once the climate change is no longer an issue. No, hold on. This is a description of the dynamics that are in place. And so as long as that's happening, we don't get to rest and find our completeness now. Once that has, and so in a way, there is great merit for the people that are not interested in looking inward and are interested in trying to change outcomes, because they are obviously having a positive effect on those circumstances. So I wouldn't wish for everyone to suddenly stop those efforts. Not while all of the doership is in place that is causing the destruction. But if an individual says, actually what I'm really looking for is not to save the world. We do think at a certain point in time that my purpose, because we're looking for purpose, we feel uncomfortable, my purpose is to save the world. So when it becomes clear for ourselves, not as an intellectual concept, but something that we really see, what I'm really looking for is happiness. And happiness is the end of suffering, and it's peace of mind. If that becomes clear, our focus then is on happiness. And in the concept it says, our happiness is not to be found in outcomes, and it is in looking and investing everything in outcomes that we obscure what is most precious for us. So if that movement happens and we find ourselves connected to ourselves, the next movement that can happen after that is, one, we become contributors to society in a way that is most useful, meaning we continue to function, but without this attitude of doership, hatred and blame, meaning that we're not, on the one hand, trying to be good, but on the other hand, contributing an energy that is not that ideal. So we become contributors on the fact that we're not adding this doership attitude into life. And then we find that we still have to live a life. We still function as the human being. And what that functioning looks like, what our destiny looks like, is not in our control. So we find ourselves faced with a question of what to do with my time. And from a place of not being attached to outcomes, we can then say, that looks like a good project. That's something I'd like to invest my time in. And we'd then do it, even if it's activism. It could be that we'll say, that's a good project, that's a worthwhile activity, I'm going to lend my support to that, and I'll do it without an attachment to outcomes. And so this notion, well, if you're not attached to the outcome, you're not going to be as effective, as efficient. And my suggestion is that if there were more activists that did what they needed to do based on their skills, but did it without an attachment to outcomes, without an insistence that life's changed, then probably the activism would be more healthy and efficient. And more important, the activist would find that they're not filled with a hatred towards the...
You actually become a better steward.
Yes.
In the process of waking up, I think you actually become a better steward, because the angst and that hatred, like, Monsanto, it's Monsanto. I mean, yeah, it is Monsanto. Like, they're basically messing up our entire food supply. But, like, I don't approach it with hate towards them. They're doing what they do. Mm-hmm. And then if we choose to do something else, then that's obviously beneficial for the longevity of humanity.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah.
And yes, I agree. It's really, if you can see the other that is functioning in a way different to what we consider to be an ideal as an equally valid part of life in this moment, then, which they are. If they weren't there, life would collapse. The whole universe would collapse on itself. So at the moment, everything is in perfect equilibrium. And attitudinally, we find that when the doership and attachment is there, very hard to see that as the case. So in each moment, if we see them to be a completely valid part of life that is delivering, in some respects we could say, because we're dividing the flow of life into pleasure and pain, they're delivering pain, but they're equally valid, even though they're delivering pain. And another thing that we need to understand if we go in with the idea that this is how life should be is that hopefully there's a humbleness to the fact that our intellect is not only our intellect, but the human being is a relative instrument. It has very limited information into the workings of the universe and why the universe is the way it is. And we tend to have very, 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 very small ideas about how things should be without understanding the real ramifications on the whole system, thinking that our out. And if someone believes that their idea in life being a certain way is right, if their ideas about that loosen up and they say, well, actually I don't really know what the impact will be on the system if these things change. There's plenty of examples, none come to mind at the moment, of a change we think is going to be helpful and it has a consequence that we had no idea about.
I know what you're saying to be true. My fear is that the average person listening will use this as an excuse to be irresponsible. Like we're only alive here today because people are putting regulations on the food we eat or on the water we drink. And my fear is that people will use that as an excuse to actually not engage and to not care. And like our humanity. So I think take it as an excuse to be like, okay, great, I don't have to do anything.
This is a good reason why it's good that a lot of people in the world are not interested in listening to this teaching.
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting point, because I find that if the sense of doership is strong enough to do something like that, it will also be strong enough to not want to listen to something like this. So it sort of balances itself out.
Yes, and yes, it does. And frankly, the observation is simple: is if someone does get exposed to this teaching, just life delivering new conditioning, and the new conditioning does create an adjustment in their up-to-date conditioning in such a way that the doership aspect gets stronger, i.e. using it as a justification or an excuse to carry on, that's destiny. And it's simply a description. This is when I say it's destiny, that's a description of how life unfolds. The bottom line is that this is the ingrained belief that causes unhappiness for the human being. It's the ingrained belief that has caused the destruction of the planet based on this egoic structure getting stronger and stronger. And so somewhere in the system, the information needs to be delivered such that these structures can be undone. So there's a lot of benefit in delivering it. And if in the process of delivering it, it does create some intensification of the egoic structure, then that's just life. The good news is that someone using the teachings as a justification or excuse doesn't actually deliver them peace of mind. They'll continue to be functioning from this egoic structure. They'll continue to be feeling uncomfortable ultimately in what they're doing in life and how they're feeling about themselves. And so at some point, if they've been exposed to the teaching enough such that it has become used as a justification and excuse, meaning hopefully the aspect that says what you're really looking for is peace of mind, and that when the peace of mind is not delivered, is not there, it's because this egoic structure, this doership structure is still in place. And so at some point in time, because using this as an excuse won't deliver peace of mind, that uncomfortableness will arise and become the trigger, hopefully, for a reconsideration of how that concept is applied for them. So life has this.
Instead of feeling that if we have to be grateful for acts of kindness, somehow an act of cruelty of the same degree is necessary for us to be able to appreciate the act of kindness, and hence the gratitude to the cruelty perpetrator somehow deserves the same as kindness in theoretically, because without the cruelty kindness cannot be appreciated, it can be seen somehow, it's like a same mechanic.
Yeah, they're interconnected opposites, so they depend on each other. And yeah, then what you're describing is actually an appreciation for life from outside the spectrum of the interconnected opposites. It's looking at the happening of life from where you have, it's actually what I would say the Buddha's, the reference to the middle path is really referencing. The middle path is not coming to the middle of either extreme. Often we hear people interpret the middle path as a point of compromise, not compromise, but what's the word when you're not overindulging? No, it's not average, but it's like do everything in moderation, right? That's considered what the middle path is, a point of moderation. Whereas actually, to me, the middle path is not about coming into the middle, it's about stepping off the spectrum of good and evil and being able to appreciate the experience of life without being caught in it. It's quite possible stronger. But if
Acts of kindness
natural, which is in itself it's not a bad thing, it just means that there will be a natural kindness which could actually be experienced as a sense of appreciation from the fact that I like to see the other helped. And so often when we find ourselves acting in a kind way, we find an appreciation just from the act itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea that we have to suffer to be happy is incorrect, in my opinion.
Pain is pleasure is not possible without pain, is what I see in some way. Like pleasure is directly connected to pain. Like
Adam and Eve experienced a lot of pleasure before they were born.
Can I say something?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think it's when we can let go of this duality, then I think a new dimension opens more, which is more of quietness, calmness,
Mhm.
and that is maybe much more valuable than the sort of kindness we seek out of duality. And that is it's like some people would want me to be happy, and I would say I don't know what is happiness, and I don't care about happiness. And they were shocked, why you don't care about happiness. I said I'm not interested in this happiness, which is based on some activity or some reason. I'm
Mhm.
happy for this, because what is the point of this? So in my life there is actually no happiness, and I'm happy.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it is different, it's out of duality.
I
It's
agree.
the same way, this kindness and cruelty, and it's all duality. And out beyond this duality, there is something which is much more valuable than the so-called pleasures of duality.
Yes, I agree completely. So this is what you've put into words very nicely.
This is my feeling. This is what I live actually.
Yeah. So what you've described is actually what we're saying here is that happiness is not to be found in outcomes, not to be found in the flow of life.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. And it's to be found in peace of mind, which is an attitude, a silence, a quietness.
Like now she was talking about Adolf Hitler doing something very cruel. Okay?
Mhm.
Then in my comparison there is also nature which is doing very cruel.
Mhm.
Like in 2005 there was a big tsunami in India, in south of India, and many people were washed away.
Mhm.
And many people were like, oh my god, it's terrible, terrible. And I used to say to them, okay, just look at it this way. Sometimes you find thousands of ants somewhere in a corner, and you bring in a bucket and you pour the water on the. What about these poor ants? You know,
Yeah.
they're experiencing the same tsunami.
Yeah.
But you don't feel for them. This is how the human mind is.
Yeah.
You know, they can do something like this, but when a tsunami happens, then they are all. So it's something out of this kind of judgmental attitude, like, oh, there was a big tsunami or something very bad, but who knows?
Mhm.
Things
Ah.
happen.
Yes, and so I agree. That's where the peace and the quietness comes from. Is it's from resting outside of being caught in the duality, and then at the same time, what I think is important at some point is to be able to acknowledge that in that place of silence, we still experience the flow of life. We still experience food that tastes good, and pain from headaches. And we understand that that is just pleasure and pain. When I say just, it's still, it's part and parcel of the experience of life. And we have to endure the pain when it's there. And we get to enjoy the pleasure as well. And so to not acknowledge the duality, which is, I didn't hear that from you actually. You were just distinguishing that the peace or is beyond the duality, and yet the life experience includes quite clearly the difference between like hot water and cold water. That difference is experiential. It's not based on conceptual judgment. It's experiential without me labeling hot and cold water. And so once that whole thing becomes integrated, where the pleasure and pain is acknowledged and experienced as happening to the body, and yet we have this place inside that is not disturbed, not disturbed attitudinally. That to me is the integration. So I agree.
I met Ramesh in Bombay, maybe about 12 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I went to one of his early morning satsang he used to do.
Can you just use the microphone? How come Vikram keeps getting it?
Yeah, I had been to Ramesh Balsikar in Mumbai, no?
Mm-hmm.
For one of his early morning discourse, like it was like 7:30, 8 o'clock. I used to start satsang.
Right.
And it was very nice to see him in his house,
Mm-hmm.
and, with his family members, and he had his daughter, his wife. Oh, I forgot, it was 12 years ago, but it was a nice atmosphere.
Right.
So
Yeah.
early in the morning, close to the Mahalakshmi temple.
Yes, we might have been there at the same time.
Yeah, possible.
It was 12 years ago, actually.
Around,
12 and a half
yes.
years ago I met him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Since then, my life has been a lot of so-called searching. You know,
Mm-hmm.
been to different masters, like Osho, then Munji, then Ramesh Balsikar. You know, different activities that we do for our search of enlightenment or understanding of our true self. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere in between, I also get the glimpse of our true self, being that which I'm looking for, and
Mm-hmm.
but the process of grounding into that that seeing, you know, like for example, Nisargadatta Maharaj says, "I am that," yeah, and having a glimpse of that, and then having to ground yourself into that. That's a part of a process, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that process is up to me or whether that process is something that eventually over years and over time just falls in place. You know.
Mm-hmm.
This I would like to know, and it could help me. Yeah.
Sure, but you see, it sounds like you what you described to me is you said your life is like this,
Yeah.
living life from outside of the an attachment to the duality.
Mm-hmm.
But now, when you're talking here, it sounds like you're still waiting for something
to happen. Or
Yeah, and this was the point of Ramesh's teachings: is that he the I am that teachings, the awakening, is part of a process. It's not the end of the line. And because of the way that those teachings are delivered, talking about the absolute, and because they need to create such a radical shift. So they need to be absolute in the way they're delivered. But my experience is that they are a part of the process, not the end of the process. And in the Veda, in the scriptures, it's don't mistake understanding for realization, and don't mistake realization for liberation. And in that, the realization is the seeing, the self-realization, the realization of the self. And don't mistake that for liberation. Liberation is the integrating of that realization back into daily living, such that you live life outside of the attachment to duality, in a place of peace. So Ramesh would say, Nisargadatta said, I am that. And Ramesh said, I am that living as this. Right? And the grounding is not to ground into being that, but to ground into being this, recognizing that it's that functioning through us, it's that having this experience. But not to go to an experience of that, but to appreciate the that in this. And so Ramesh's point was, you're not seeking truth, you're not seeking enlightenment, you're not seeking oneness. Keep it practical. In practical terms, what we're seeking is happiness for the human being. And happiness for the human being comes along with a realization of who we are. And in practical terms, that happiness is peace of mind. And so what you described to me is the peace of mind that comes when we remain connected to ourselves, and to have an expectation that what I'm really waiting for is to be grounded in a place where maybe the experiences of oneness or continuous experience of what happened in the glimpse. You know, that's an expectation. I speak from personal experience because my relationship with Ramesh, or the relationship with the teaching, was having gone to him prior to hearing his teachings. I had gone with a very strong awakening and stabilization into being that through the teachings of Ramana and Nisargadatta, such that there was a lot of peace in my life because a lot of the misunderstanding had been uprooted. But I was still left with some of the remnants of those wonderful teachings that I had turned into beliefs, had turned into expectations. And it was Ramesh saying, no, Roger, keep what you're really looking for. Be clear on that. Don't run with a belief that has been put in place. Don't run with a belief that you're looking for the word enlightenment and then not be clear on what that is. So if I'm going to describe enlightenment, I'm going to describe it in its practical terms, and that is to be at peace regardless of circumstance. And because that wasn't clear at some point, and I still thought I was waiting for oneness experience, that became seen as an expectation. It became seen as the basis on which the remaining suffering that was there was based on. And when it clicked, oh, I have what I'm looking for. Experientially in my life, there wasn't a lot of suffering except for these few expectations that were left, that Ramesh thankfully corrected. And as soon as they fell away, it's like, so this is it. And then it became clear, I never was looking for a state of oneness. I had states of oneness. I had peak experiences. And it was actually having those peak experiences that made the thinking mind draw the conclusion, this is it. This is enlightenment. Enlightenment really is a state of oneness. And when that fell away, because of a practical pointing, what are you really looking for? And I realized, yes, it's true. I'm just looking for the end of suffering. I'm just looking for the end of the uncomfortableness. And that expectation was one of the last seeds from which some uncomfortableness arose.
Well, actually, my suffering diminished almost 80%, 90% finish.
Yeah.
My life was so mess. and then finally it was like no problem. Everything was good.
Yeah. So what's the remaining 10%? Let's say.
It's related with my experiences with people who don't have that deep understanding. For example, if I'm married and with my wife, I can have many conflicts, but not because of but because of the difference in the level of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So I can have a lot of conflicts. Not that she's wrong or I'm right, or it's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're together, life brings situations, and in that situation, she has her mind, and I have my acceptance and relaxed situation.
Mm-hmm.
She cannot, kind of. It becomes very, very difficult, and so then it's like, well, it's part of life. I take it
Mm-hmm.
the way it comes, but still, if I like to share something, I go to France every 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of involved with body work and some kind of help and support I can give mentally or spiritually for them,
Mm-hmm.
to help them get out of their little suffering and little bit closed being. So I do a lot, and people really appreciate what I do. But I
Mhm.
have a lot of conflicts with my wife in this matter.
So just in the framework, Ramesh would say that is part of the flow of life,
Yeah.
completely understandable. The flow of life is sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. So on an experiential level, the conflict would be categorized as pain, and then the pointus is our happiness, our completeness is not dependent on life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so it sounds like what you said is that you understand that it is what it is. Hopefully you understand it is what it is as pain in the moment. And if the conflict is simply a pain conflict, then that doesn't disturb our peace of mind. It's simply conflict on the level of the flow of life. So anger might arise as a biological reaction. You might have to put up with your wife's anger as a biological reaction. All of that is pain. The conflict on an inner level is if we are resisting, i.e. not accepting on an inner level the pain in the moment coming from that situation. So this, once again, that to me, that's just once I hear the situation, I say, okay, these are the concepts that describe it. And maybe what you're describing as conflict is just simply the natural pain of the duality of the flow of life. And the question is there suffering conflict, which is blame towards your wife for that, or guilt towards yourself, or an expectation that life will look different?
I think there is more expectation that life should be different, life should be more smooth and flowing, and
Yeah,
there is more expectation than pain or suffering.
sure.
So it's the expectation.
But expectation is one of the categories of suffering, which is, it's one of, so that's as a description, because sometimes we might, well, it can go very unnoticed, this expectation.
And it also puts me in doubt over my own being of being able to be in this situation, and then sharing also becomes difficult, and I just close myself and it's not open for anybody.
Yeah.
Don't want to do anything, and because I sort of expect that my marriage life should be very smooth.
Mm-hmm.
It's the expectation again.
Yeah. I know
It's not a joke, because I didn't want to get married, but somehow life put me in this situation, and it's like this.
Yeah.
We were traveling, me and my wife, and we went by car to Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Kerala.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way we had some fight, and she took a bag. She said, "I'm going my way, and you go your way." So I took the car and I came to Pune straight away. I said, "Okay, you enjoy."
Ah. Oh, that's how you're here.
Yeah, that's how I'm here.
I thought I thought that's how you accidentally got married. Thank you.
I just want to clarify the pain thing. Like, would it be accurate to say that if the degree of pleasure that we have a capacity to experience is like almost mathematically connected to the degree of pain, the capacity to experience?
I guess the appreciation of it is in part a result of contrast.
Yeah, that's what was my yeah.
But so that's an aspect of it. But without contrast, I think still, like, say, boiling hot water is still boiling hot water in the moment. Right. You don't require a contrast of what warm water is like. To appreciate a difference between a cold shower and a warm shower, for example, you need to have the appreciation of what a warm shower feels like, right? But a cold shower without having ever had a warm shower, for example, right, is still going to be painful to someone. They might be normal, but it doesn't mean that normal is not painful, because the pain is not actually just a result of a psychological comparison. It's a result of the biological makeup of the body. And so, often people say that there is no pleasure or pain in life unless you label it. Right? What that teaching is doing is actually realizing that people have an attachment to pleasure and pain, meaning that as soon as they label something pleasure or pain, they are really saying, I am fulfilled by this or not fulfilled by it. And that's the problem, right? So a teaching will say, stop labeling anything as pleasure or pain. It doesn't exist unless you label it. And that's a way of breaking the attachment by getting the mind to just say, it just is what it is. Right? And then once that's seen, that the suffering falls away when we stop judging or functioning out of attachment. If that falls away, then someone says, pleasure and pain doesn't exist. It was just a figment of my imagination. Actually, the figment was the attachment to the pleasure or pain. The process that said the process of breaking the attachment says there is no pleasure or pain until you label it. Right? Which is not entirely true. It's a teaching, it's a methodology. And at some point, we might realize, I've taken a pointer and now believed it. I'm going around saying there's no pleasure or pain unless I label it. And I say, you stick your finger in the door and slam it. And don't label it and tell me that there's no pleasure or pain. There is pain based on not your labeling, but based on the physical biology of the experience. And so what you're saying has merit, is that the contrast is important. Because if we wished for bliss, if we thought our happiness is to be found in bliss, which and we got the bliss, and it became normal, then that bliss wouldn't feel the same as when we didn't have the bliss all the time. But once the bliss is there all the time, if we still think that our happiness is to be found in pleasure, we will seek a higher bliss. And when we get it, it will feel, this is higher. And then if we got that continuously, it would become normal. But the very fact that life is not always one pleasure means we don't even need pain. We can just need to go to neutral, let's say. And then when we have pleasure, the pleasure is experienced based on the neutral standpoint.
But will it be neutral? That's what I felt, that neutral is sort of a a pain then.
Neutral is a spectrum on the pleasure-pain spectrum.
Yeah,
right?
But if you don't have pain, then neutral would be pain, isn't it? Sort of what we call neutral.
Technically, but you could also have mild pleasure that relative to extreme pleasure, do you say that is pain? Relative to the extreme pleasure, it's pain. But in and of itself, mild pleasure isn't pain. So we could experience pleasure even without having pain, just by having something different to it. And it comes down to, the question is, do you call neutral pain, or do you call it neutral? It's just a labeling of it. It's the contrast that's important.
Yeah, I think I get it. I think what I was getting a feeling of this, like I think it was more like the degree of aversion we might have to pain would be the degree of attraction that we might have to pleasure, like from a suffering standpoint. I think that's, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So, but you're saying that pain is not necessary to experience pleasure, yeah? Like,
just change is necessary. So I think, like if I'm going through the day, I could say I didn't have any pain today, and then tonight I'll go and have a chocolate cake and I'll experience pleasure. Yeah, it's. But you're right. I often say there is no neutral point in the pleasure-pain spectrum. It's neutral is such a fine line that you could say it doesn't exist, or you could say that a lot of things actually, like just sitting, waiting for the bus, is neutral. It's not a great pleasure and it's not a great pain for someone. But technically, you'd actually say, well, the cars going past, even though maybe you're not registering it as strong pain, is mild pain. So the question of what neutral is very subjective. It's not actually so important whether there's a neutral or there's just very, very, very mild pain, very, very, very mild pleasure. Yeah. So, thank you.